Good
Hi, Margaret.
afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're excited to get this started. We're recording now. This webinar is being recorded. So thank you for joining us as we continue our democracy webinar series, Lunch Out Loud, Finding Our Voices When Democracy is Challenged. These webinars, as I've said, are sponsored by the ACLU of West Virginia, Common Defense West Virginia, National Association of Social Workers West Virginia, Rise Up WV, West Virginia Citizens Action Group, West Virginia Citizens for Clean Elections, and the West Virginia Faith Table. As you can see, we bring citizens, experts, and voters together to stay up to date on the latest developments in our democracy and learn and prepare how to face those challenges. And I hope that you have your notepad ready, or you're going to be taking notes on your computer, because after today's discussion, I have a feeling that you will have some action items that you have to attend to. I am former West Virginia Secretary of State Natalie Tennant. Welcome and thank you for spending your lunch with us. Please continue to eat and prepare any questions for the panel as we go along. You can put them in chat and we'll be able to discuss it. This is going to be a lively conversation, I have a feeling, as you can see already. And we are discussing the West Virginia Legislature and access to it, transparency, and the process of it in 2023 and 2024 and before and in the future. This hour is going to be used to explain how the legislature is being run now and to teach citizens how they can interact with lawmakers and the process. We will also offer suggestions and focus on what the best practices would be for access and interaction. And we have a great panel comprised of experience, knowledge, and years of service when it comes to understanding the complexity of the legislative process. And I'm going to start off with Eli Baumwell, who's Policy Director of ACLU of West Virginia. And I'm starting with Eli because, Eli, you were so anxious to get this started. You wanted this to be our first webinar when actually last month we talked about the opinions of the U.S. Supreme Court and the impact that it would have on all of us. So now we are here talking about the legislature because this is something that you wanted to discuss with people. Why did you think that this democracy webinar would be so important?
Yeah, thank you. And good afternoon to you, Natalie, to our other panelists, to everyone who's watching. Thanks everyone for taking some time to learn about this, because I do think it's really important. And I think it's important because there are some really fundamental things when we look at our legislature, when we look at our representatives. You know, we expect and we need to have a transparent government so that we know what's going on, so that we can be informed as citizens. You know, when we're electing our representatives, if we don't know what they're up to, we can't make good decisions about who we want representing us in our interests. So that's really important. It's really important that our representatives are involved in careful, thoughtful legislative debate. You know, even when people come in with ideology, and everyone comes in with ideology, we still expect our representatives to come in and look at the issues and think about the issues and not be a rubber stamp for a political party or an ideology. And I think it's really important because even though it is a representative government, we expect our representatives to get feedback from us, to listen to us, to give us an opportunity to opine on the matters that come up. And you know, I'll tell everyone here, I've been a lobbyist now for 8 years. And so I get the unique privilege and honor to get to go in and watch the legislative process day in, day out when our legislature's in session. And even in that 8-year span that I've been there, I have seen a gradual change in some of these long-standing policies, practices. Again, these are things that have been around for a really long time, but they've gradually been used more frequently, been used more egregiously to cut out the transparency, to cut out public participation, to maybe move towards more of that rubber stamp. So that's been my observation. And that's concerning in and of itself. But then I think you look at what's going on nationally with all these attacks and erosions of our democratic process and our democracy. And that's what this whole series is about. So, you know, stepping back, looking at why this whole series matters. I think that this state and what we're seeing in our legislature is just a microcosm of things. And it's where we can really get involved at a local level. So that's why I think it's so important.
Yeah. Wow. You have a lot of stuff that we're going to break down and try to break down a little bit here. And you say that you've been a lobbyist for the last 8 years, and you've seen some of this. Why, I hate to say, oh, well, could it get worse? I mean, give an example of just even one thing, because I know we have the other experts and folks who are on this panel. Like, what was there one thing that put you over the edge, or that was just, this is unbelievable to me?
Sure. So
it might not be, because I feel like you might have been the frog in the water as the water continually gets warmer, where some of us who are looking from the outside in are like, whoa, they did that. Go ahead.
So I think one of the great examples of just a really egregious, movement here was at the beginning of the last legislative session. There's been a lot of conversation about wanting to reorganize DHHR, good or bad. And on the first day of legislative session, the Senate came out with a massive bill that split DHHR up into 3 separate entities, and without any debate, without any committee review, with senators who were on their first day of their very first legislative session, the Senate suspended our constitutional rules and kicked it out of one of the 2 chambers that's supposed to review that. And that cut a lot of people who would have been interested in this bill out of that conversation. And again, it meant that if there was debate, if there was thought put into it, it was done behind closed doors and not in that transparent way that we expect government to operate. So that to me was one really egregious example.
Yeah, I mean, that's there you pinpointed there. As you can see from the screen, our other panelist names pop up, and that is former Delegate Barbara Fleischauer, longtime delegate, longtime advocate for the people of West Virginia from Monongalia County. And Delegate, I guess, yes, you ran in 22. So last year was your first year out in quite a while. I just can't imagine what you were thinking as you were watching and continue to watch, the frustration that must have been boiling as you see this. Are there any positives to what we've seen? And maybe we can, Eli's really condensed and crystallized what a main issue was. Are there any positives out of it? I certainly can see the negatives.
Well, I think you have to have a little bit of historical perspective. And I think Phil and I both have been around a very, very long time. And we remember when the Democrats were in control. And when the Democrats were in control, there was a longtime delegate named John Overton who always wanted our votes to be recorded. And the Democrats wanted to have a voice vote so that people could not have to be accountable for the votes. And, of course, that was the right thing to do. And when the Republicans took control, that was one of the first things they did. The Republicans used to talk about accountability, and they do that a lot less so now. For example, the not having video on the House side where they have it on the Senate side. And so there are a lot of things out there. So I guess, it has gotten worse. Maybe my blood isn't boiling, but I do think we need to maybe at some point, Natalie, look at what the rules are that govern participation in the legislative process. It's a 60-day session. Whoever has the majority is going to try to exercise control, and the Democrats did that. The Republicans are really in control right now. But I would like to talk a little bit about the rules at some point in time during this discussion.
That's very fair. And I do want to mention that John Overton was actually the longest serving delegate for the longest time, and he was a Republican from Martinsburg in Berkeley County. And for the longest time, I can even remember, as you first come into a new term, he oversaw it because he was the longest one, right? He was the longest serving. Right. And that's interesting that there was a nod to him. And, I certainly, as I sit here as a fellow Democrat with you, Delegate, I don't want to sit here and pine like, oh, Democrat, this is what we did long ago, and this was so great. There were mistakes that Democrats made too, but I can certainly remember too, as a former reporter, before I was an elected official, having that access and just being able to walk through and see all the doors open and things like that. So I understand where you're coming from in those regards, and we will talk a little bit about that. Oh, Margaret already wants to jump in before, but go ahead, Margaret. Margaret Chapman-Pomponio, Executive Director of West Virginia Free. Go ahead and make a statement. Then I'll ask Phil about this transparency and what's happening. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I would like to add that a concern that we have is, and I've been lobbying for now, I was wet behind the ears when I started at West Virginia Free, and it's been over 20 years now. And I've seen a real rise in bills that originate in committee. And that means that there's no ability for the public to vet, and there's no ability for legislators to vet it. It's only 60 days. They're already, they've got tons of bills they have to get through. And if you're someone from the public who's tracking an issue that is important to you, to not have the time to study a bill, it's really shutting people out. The other issue that I see happening more frequently is a dispensing of the second reference. So, bills go through committees, and now often, even if they've been given more than one reference, they just take it straight to the floor after only having been through one committee. And again, it's the same thing. It's a disservice, not just to the public, but to legislators as well, because all of a sudden they've got a bill on the floor and they haven't had any chance to study it. Stakeholders haven't been able to come in. For example, I work in reproductive health and rights, and the medical profession, who we want legislators to hear from about the damaging effects of the restrictions that they're passing. They don't have time to just drop all their patients and get down to the Capitol. Disadvantaged folks, frankly, most people, but particularly disadvantaged people who are parents, they're caregivers, they're working, can't just drop everything to try to figure out what the legislature is rushing through.
Yeah, I can see that, and it's you can't pinpoint, and that's then if I, as a citizen, as a constituent, can't catch all the balls that are being thrown, then I'm relying on the media, and I'm relying on there's only one Phil Kabler of the world who brings more than 30 some years experience. Many times you have a young reporter, and I'll speak from the broadcast side, the television side, you have a young reporter heading down, meaning new, like I was heading down to the Capitol, been there 30 years, is having trouble with the transparency. How are we relying on the newer reporters who are coming down? So Phil, who is, as I said, a columnist, retired, longtime State House reporter for the Charleston Gazette-Mail. Are you able, you're not putting out fires, and I hate this term whack-a-mole, but it really is that, when another bill or something comes up out of a committee, you're rushing over there, you're rushing over there. How are you able to cover it to inform the public?
Thanks, and apologize in advance for the dim lighting here in the Capitol press room, but do what we can, I guess.
It's okay.
And unfortunately, as you say, I'm semi-retired. I still write my column, but don't do any daily news coverage anymore, which is, from my perspective, quite a relief, because any of the elements that are preventing transparency for the public obviously affect the media. And as you say, we have an influx of new State House reporters. And I know I spent my first year just trying to find committee rooms, let alone trying to break any news stories. And so I think there's, I don't want to call it a hostility, but there's a negative attitude toward the media now among the current supermajority, which I think affects our ability to cover the sessions. I'll give, and as we were talking about some of the techniques that they claim are in the sake of expediency, such as single referencing bills, originating bills in committee, and moving bills, having bills introduced and then taken up in committee that afternoon. All these processes make it more difficult to keep up with coverage of the session. I'll give one example that comes to mind, that in the past, when there were differences in House and Senate versions of bills, they would be put in conference committee, and conference committees meet in public. You can watch the process, and then the conference committee reports, which is effectively the compromise bill, are available well in advance of the vote, even on the last day of the session. I think the conference reports have to be filed by 8 p.m. I think after 30 some years, I would remember that. But now they've adopted a process, rather than put bills into conference committee where there's a level of transparency, they come up with a little gimmick, which is on the floor, they'll concur with further amendment, which this is a floor amendment, so there's no document available to see exactly what the amendment is. And as we've seen in past sessions, sometimes they concur with further amendment and bounce it back and forth between the houses until you have 3 or 4 different concurrences with further amendment. And at that point, you have no clue what's in the bill. So even if you're someone who's been up here as long as I have, that whole process in particular is designed to assure that the public in general and the press in particular are in the dark about what they're doing.
Yeah, no pun intended. I was joking that it's, kind of cool to see you in silhouette, Phil, that, it might have lawmakers worried or elected officials worried. But it's like you said, they're not worried because they're not talking, or they're not being transparent. And it seems they have that ability.
In newspaper reports, so-and-so did not respond to a request for comment. It's over and over again. It's just ignoring the media as much as they can.
Yeah, and I can remember when I first got into office, actually talking to the auditor, I think not the elected auditor, legislative auditor, Aaron Allred, and I said, how do we get people, to respond? It's like, if I can't get someone to do that as Secretary of State, he's like, well, you go to the media, which, having been a former member of the media, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. And so what do we do? There are a lot of questions in the chat, and I know not everyone who's in attendance can read it, but the hosts and panelists certainly can. So we've been reading these, and we want to make sure that we can help find solutions too, not just sit here. I mean, it is good. It is good for people who don't follow the legislature as closely as those in attendance or on the panel to understand what is taking place. So we first make people aware, and then it's about what is their action item, what is the public's action item, and their next step. And Delegate, I feel like you had a question that you wanted to say right now before we kind of get into some of these questions from the panel. Is there anything else?
I do. I think it's in the chat. I tried to go through and think about what rules, what is in the Constitution, because there's the word transparency is not there. What parts of our federal, and I just want to go through that real quick. The federal law governs, the Constitution governs, and the laws govern. That takes precedence. And then we have our state constitution. And I don't know how people can access, but there's some interesting things in there, like the right to petition. Article 3 is our West Virginia Bill of Rights in our West Virginia Constitution. It has a freedom of press and speech guarantee, but it also has one sentence that says the right of the people to assemble in a peaceable manner, to consult for the common good, to instruct their representatives, or to apply for redress of grievances shall be held inviolate. I think that's a really interesting section. That is not in the federal constitution. That is in our state constitution. We have a right to instruct our representatives, and we may need to be thinking some more. How can we give that real meaning? We also have a Freedom of Information Act.
Let's go to that, Delegate. Let's just hit that a little bit. As you mentioned that it's 316, and it's part of that link that Julie just put in there, because there was a question that's in the question and answer from Mason. Now you're talking about more of a gathering, right? When you talk about that line, but Mason Jack has a question.
No. That's only one piece of it. That's the right of public assembly. But there's a specific thing in there that says the right to instruct your representatives. And that would be your elected representatives and also the government. It's part of a First Amendment kind of theory.
How would you use that as citizenry? How would you enact that to instruct representatives?
Well, that's a really big question. And it's really kind of the opposite of transparency, because transparency is saying that you want to hear what the representatives are saying, but you can't be discriminated against for trying to speak to, for the media going into somebody's office, knocking on the door, asking for an opportunity to speak. There are a lot of ways, but I think one of the ways that constitutional provision is affected is through the Freedom of Information Act, and also through the open meetings laws. We now have laws that put the constitutional provisions into effect. We also have House and Senate rules, which are really in the weeds, that say what is allowed to happen. And the Constitution says the legislature is allowed to rule itself. So that's in there. But the way we implement that is in part through our laws. And there are enforcement mechanisms that you can sue, but it's complicated. It's sort of after the fact. You can void a decision of a governmental body that doesn't abide by the open meetings laws. You can make it void. So all I'm saying is we should think about how to use the tools we have. Somebody mentioned initiative and referendum. We would have to change our constitution to do that. We would have to have a vote of the legislature, and it would have to be a supermajority, and then that would go to a vote of the people. So that would be the Republicans always used to want to, John Overton especially wanted initiative and referendum, and now the Republican majority does not want that.
And a lot of people have been clamoring for that, for putting abortion on the ballot. I think after the overturn of Roe, we would have success here, like we've seen in other states, and they won't do it. It takes 2/3 of the body.
Both houses.
Right.
Yeah. So Mason, I hope that answered your question. So that is the case. And we saw, Ohio was very interesting that because of the abortion question that's coming in November, and they wanted to make it a higher threshold. Well, the voters in August knocked that down for the state of Ohio. Yeah, and it was very interesting, Margaret, that after, after last year, 2022, in this legislative session, they didn't think that it will, well, for the fall election of 2022, they didn't think that the abortion question needed to go on in West Virginia because we just had it in 2018, if I remember all that correctly. So thank you, Delegate. That is, well, actually, did you want to continue a little bit, or anyone else want to jump in on that, on helping with my question? Because I know that there are so many activists and advocates who are on this discussion with us. We want to do something, and what are we going to be able to do to question, put their feet to the fire? I mean, ultimately, it comes down to elections. I mean, they don't have to say anything. They don't have to be transparent when you have a super duper majority, if that's even something. I think that's probably the thinking that they go with many times.
Well, oh, Eli, you go ahead.
Sure, I'll just throw two things out. The first thing is I think, to echo what you said, Natalie, a lot of this is going to come down to elections. We need to elect representatives who want to be transparent, who want to be thoughtful. If they show up and they just want to pass a party line, and they're knowing and they're hoping that people aren't paying attention and they're voting for a letter after the name, then that's what we're going to get. We're going to get a party rather than our representatives who are really controlling it. It doesn't matter what the ideology, what the issue is. I think that people on all sides of the political spectrum want and expect these sorts of things, this responsiveness, this transparency. So that's what we need to do, is raise that awareness. And again, that just comes back to why this is so important. And I just want to sort of expound on what Barbara was talking about in terms of one of the ways that people were given by the legislature an opportunity to weigh in, and how that's been rolled back a little bit. And that's this public hearing process. So when an issue, at least before the House, is coming up in front of a committee, any member of the public, any member can request from the committee chair the ability to have a public hearing. And that's where they will sort of stop the process, bring the public in, and hear from them. And what I've seen, again, just over the last 8 years, is they've actually officially changed the rules. So it used to be that the bill couldn't be taken up in a committee until they had that public hearing, and they decided that slowed things down too much. So now the committee can actually vote on, they'll have the public hearing, but the committee can actually go ahead with their consideration and vote on it anyway. And what we've also seen is that when they have these public hearings, they're often very poorly attended. The legislators who are in the committee, even other members, often aren't there. They don't show up, and if they are there, they can be very dismissive to viewpoints that they disagree with.
Especially at 8 in the morning.
Yeah.
It makes it really hard, really hard for anyone who doesn't live in around Kanawha County and can roll out of bed and go to it. It's very, very hard to, well, there's no, I guess that one of the things I put at the end of my little listing of things that apply was, what would a fair process be? And what would fair rules be? And I didn't think about public hearing. That is one of the most important things in the House rules that does not exist in the Senate rules. So I think one thing that would be fair would be having a Senate public hearing rule. But I do think we have an opportunity. We're in a bad situation. We should think big. What would make things better? And Phil, I think it would be good to think about what would make things better for the media. Things,
hearings, they've become, as you say, kind of farcical. They have hearings early in the mornings and often on as little as a few hours notice. So anyone outside the Charleston area, it's almost an impossibility to get here. Then they have limited speakers to, I think, as little as 15 seconds to comment. I think the anti-abortion bill, that the speakers were limited to 15 seconds, which of course is absurd. So they've reduced the public hearing process almost to a absurdity that, I don't know, over the course of history.
Especially if you traveled 3 or 4 hours to get there.
Right.
That would, it's
Right.
just so insulting to the
Well,
public.
And I'd like to add that, one of the, there were some silver linings to the COVID shutdown, right? And the ability to weigh in committee meetings via Zoom and to have public hearings via Zoom, I think was actually great. We tried to get some public hearings held that way, or at least have that as an option when there's snowstorms. I mean, to have legislators forcing the public to risk their lives because of the conditions outside, I think is dangerous, frankly. And, I'd like to see them embrace that kind of flexibility a little bit more. I mean, if you really say you want to hear from constituents, then you got to make it easier. And along those lines, I'd like to say also about the legislative website. So you mentioned Aaron Allred earlier, Natalie, and I remember when we didn't have the legislative website, you had to go to the Capitol, you get printed copies of the bills, and you work from all the paper, and there were pros and cons to that. But the website really, I mean, frankly, compared to other states, we've got a good tracking system on that website. And I think they should publicize it more. And teach people how to use it. They could do some easy public education on that. Basically on the website right now, though, is what we have is like how a bill becomes a law. Well, we all know that's not really the process it goes through. But, so they could do more there. And then the other thing is with the website, though, with all the originating bills and the comm subs and stuff moving so quickly, staff just doesn't have the time to get the website updated in a timely fashion so that the public can really track it. So I think it was a great start, and the spirit of it needs to be honored and really used for the public's benefit.
Yeah, speaking of the website, I would say the one improvement in transparency, as you say, is the ability for bills that aren't originating in committee or so forth, but to be able to see amendments in real time. Back in the ink on paper days, you would have to go to a committee clerk or a committee counsel to track down copies of amendments. And of course, on the last day of the session, that was simply impossible to track amendments for all the bills that are going through. And remember my old colleague, Tom Searles, would, for the 2 or 3 weeks after the session, he would wait for the enrolled bills to come back from the printer to see what the legislators had snuck into these bills. In fact, Senate Finance Chairman Osho Crago was infamous for saying an amendment was technical cleanup when it was really something substantive. So Tom would go through these enrolled bills and frequently find 2 or 3 bills where there have been really substantive changes made that weren't made public at the time. So the lack of the current leadership doesn't have didn't invent lack of transparency. So
I can think of another good example, Jerry Mezzatesta. I remember one time when he did an amendment to it was some kind of bingo bill that added by the way, you can serve alcohol. And that was a technical cleanup. Yeah, I think, another thing that has been very traditional on the Senate side that is terrible is at least the House side says all amendments have to be in writing. And on the Senate side, there is no similar requirement. So they can have a conceptual amendment that you will not see until a Senate attorney drafts it. And whether it's consistent with what that person intended or not, even the person who offered the amendment might not see that or realize what's put in there. So a lot of this is about control of the leadership. The leaders hire the attorneys, and the attorneys do the bidding of the leaders. And I think I'd like to see And one of the things I put in that, what would be a fair process? I would like to see like a Bill of Rights for public participation, that would say how would, and I don't think we should limit this to just the legislature. We have 3 branches of government. And someone just brought to my attention this morning the $84 billion Chinese agreement with West Virginia University. There is and I listed that there are 22 exceptions to the Freedom of Information Act. There are a whole bunch more that are buried in other sections of the code that are not in the FOIA Act. And one of them has to do with economic development, is we do not disclose the terms of contracts that are with companies that we are doing economic development. Apparently, this new hydrogen thing that they're talking about doing has a potential for 62 billion, I'm not sure, dollars, and no one can see that. Can we now see the Chinese deal that was like 8 years ago or whatever? I think the executive branch needs to have sunlight, as you know, Phil, because of those press conferences where the press isn't allowed to be there. I think maybe the judicial branch. We have 3 branches of government, and I think that we need to make sure that there is actual sunshine, that there is actual transparency. We have these rules right now. Maybe we need to change them. Maybe we need to be talking about initiative, referendum, and recall. Although that's something I would be a little bit wary of, because that could go a lot of different ways. But I think, Eli, thank you and the ACLU for sparking this conversation. It's very, very valuable to say, what would fairness look like when it comes to the legislative process and the implementation of bills through the executive branch?
Right. And that is, the action item that I talked about for all of us here. What would you want to see on a citizen's Bill of Rights? And, I've thought about this too. And Betty Rivard and I have a lot of thinking in common like this, because the next thing that we have to do is we have an election. People are going to be clamoring to say, oh, I filed my certificate of intent to run. Well, some of the things being asked should be, instead of, what are you going to do about, my road or something, you need to also be asking, what are you going to do about getting video in committee rooms in the House of Delegates? What are you going to do about having public hearings spread across, like those substantial things that you can't, don't tell me that you want to talk to the constituents and then not tell me that you don't think an 8 a.m. every Monday is good or bad. So I agree with you on that, Betty, that we do make these kind of a scorecard. Now, I know we do have lots of questions that I want to get to. We have about 18 minutes left to be respectful of everyone's time. Franklin has a good question. Have the waiver of 3 separate readings on separate days been challenged in court ever? Because this is where I think a lot of this is going to have to come down. It's go to circuit court and challenge something like this.
Well, let me answer that one. It's a real easy one. It's in the Constitution. The second thing I put in there, I put a reference to that section of the Constitution. It says that you can override the requirement for reading a bill on 3 separate days by a 4/5 vote. But it also says you can never override the requirement of reading bills. I'm scrolling back through. So that is something in the Constitution. You can require that every bill be read. Now, that's often called the nuclear option, but I think we should be aware of the tools that we have and use them if need be. And that is one of the tools that asks, if something is very, very offensive, like transgender legislation, I was looking back at that comment, we should ask that bill be read. Let's make sure that people know what their legislators are voting on. Or guns, campus guns, make that bill be read. And Republicans use that. Scruffy Buffy Warner used that, and he did it for a couple of days. Remember, he stayed overnight.
Right.
Phil and Natalie and Margaret, I don't know if you were back there but we should be sure we know what our actual rules are and use them and think about what would make it better. And these two, the video and the public hearings, could definitely be improved.
So
Well,
how do we get the public, we need the folks on this who are watching this want solutions. What can they be doing to get that? How do they go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I mean, this sounds really simple, and I know probably a lot of you are already doing this, but you know, the issues that you care about, you know, follow the advocacy organizations like those of us on this call and the sponsoring orgs, social media during legislative session. We try to keep things updated. The other thing is that's actually good coming out of the House and the Senate clerk's offices is their Twitter feed. I mean, it's good for floor business. It's not great for committees, but that's a quick go-to place when you're trying to track bills, you know, down to the minute.
Well, so the other thing, you know, getting back to this idea of what can we do, you know, I love this idea of a Bill of Rights, and I will probably be the person shouting the loudest. I hate these pledges that candidates sign, committing them to things years down the road before they've really studied an issue. But my gosh, wouldn't it be great to have something that says, here are some commitments to transparency and to inclusion that we are asking candidates to sign. And again, I think this is the sort of thing that transcends partisan politics, because it doesn't matter what your ideology is. I think everyone agrees we want our representatives to represent us, to listen to us, to be transparent with what we're doing. And if something like this is developed and is shared around, you know, again, it doesn't matter who it is at your Thanksgiving table, and you say, hey, this is what I want to see my candidate sign. I think everyone's looking and say, yeah, I agree. And get that going, get that, you know, if we're gonna do this idea of pledges, that should be the thing. So that's, I think, a really great way.
And what about a debate about that? You know, if you say that you believe in transparency, you know, tell me why you won't offer this as a change to the rules, or tell, you know, like maybe a debate before the session starts between the minority and the majority, and ask, do you believe? And if not, why not? And if, you know, their solution might be not to show up, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with pledges too.
Barbara, you had some good thoughts, I know, about the importance of the interims process, and I thought maybe in that regard, making some of those would be good.
Yeah, and that goes along with what you were saying of following the process. We've had a little bit of back and forth about interims over the years. That used to be the time when the real work of the legislature got done, where there was group process, where people discussed bills and flushed out ideas, and then that sort of faded away. I think COVID contributed to that. At one point, before COVID, a decision was made to dramatically cut back on interims. And then when COVID happened, that became the rule. And then it was brought back. It still is not to the point where it used to be, where there used to be give and take between all different parties and involvement of stakeholders during the interim process. That was the way, and just for those who might not be so familiar, it's a monthly process, 3 days, where there are committee meetings and ideas are proposed, and people are given an opportunity to talk. And to me, that's a really sensible way to plan for the session. That has happened less and less, but it's a really good tool.
Well,
Yeah.
and to that end,
Right.
But I think the interim process is less effective when you have these bills coming down from these various organizations that you copy and paste the bills that they propose nationally. So the interim process works when you really are intent on devising new legislation. But if you're just simply taking Koch brother bills or whatever and regurgitating them, that you don't really need an interim process. So I think that's why we've seen the under the current leadership, as you say, they drastically reduced the number of days for interim meetings, and then frequently, as we had with this last special session, special sessions are called to supersede on scheduled interims, which generally mean most of the interim meetings are canceled or truncated. So the interim process, I don't think has ever worked the way it was envisioned, but particularly now, it's kind of a non-necessity if you're getting your bills handed down to you from these various political action committees.
So I mean that actually speaks to another thing, you know, that I've seen, which is, you know, the legislature and legislators are allowed to meet in small groups and are allowed to have sort of behind the scenes discussions. That's an important part of the legislative process. But again, we all sort of have this understanding that the substantive debate is supposed to be public, is supposed to be transparent. And technology has really enabled legislators to meet with just the people they want to, and with just the folks they want to, and to have these long email threads and text threads, some of which they have successfully exempted from FOIA and from public records requests, where they're doing all that substantive debate, so that by the time it actually gets to the floor, you know, it's not just a group of three who've met. Everyone has already met. They've already had all the debate, and they've got a bill that they've done all the debate on, where no one gets to see it, no one gets to be part of the process, and they're ready to go ahead and move it forward. And I think that does us a real disservice too. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things. But we need to fix that. We need to commit to saying, changing our public, our sunshine law, and saying, hey, if you're having these sort of debates and it's not just 2 or 3 people, you've got the majority of a committee, or you've got the majority of a party on this discussion, that's not exempt. You can't call that a caucus meeting. You can't call that, you know, one of these exemptions. This should be public, because that's one of the ways they're getting around these debates.
Well, here are some questions that we want to get to with Tobias has asked this question early on, that Tobias says they are a transgender psychiatrist. They teach LBGT and transgender mental health at the medical school. And you can read, he knows the studies, the science, the medicine, the psychology. It's clear. It blows me away that how I can help be a voice for my community. It may go back to what Margaret had said earlier. I mean, it sounds like you're doing some of that, Tobias, by being on here too. It's a tough environment to be heard. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that. Then Barbara says she used to have multiple districts or multiple delegates in her district. Now, one Republican refuses to talk to her in person, on the phone, or via email. Any suggestions?
Letter to the editor.
Yeah, the single member districts, I think it's been considerable debate, but it does, multi-member districts, it's been proven over and over again, make it improve the chances for women and minority candidates to win election. And I personally didn't have an issue with multi-delegate districts, but that was one of the big pushes of the current majority, was to go to 100 single member districts, which we have now. And like you say, if you're in,
And it was really a push of the Chamber of Commerce.
right.
Yeah, that was really, they thought that they could, I mean, that word control keeps coming up in my mind. That was one of the ways they thought they would get control. Yeah, it's easier to control things when there aren't any women there.
Let's talk real quick about what the power of social media might be, because we've all hit around this. We're sitting here on a webinar where we're coming from all different parts of the state, and we know that would be beneficial. I agree with you, Margaret, about back in 2021, I think we were able to get that elections bill stopped because of a virtual hearing like that. And this plays a little bit into maybe or maybe not a suit that the ACLU has against an Eastern Panhandle elected official. But I mean, you said letter to the editor, Delegate, and I think also, I don't know how much connection that Barbara has on social media. I mean, can we put out our own social media saying my own delegate won't talk to me? I know that she can't probably go to that delegate and put it on a personal social media outlet. But if that elected official has a public page, then she could most certainly put it on there. You want to talk about that, Eli, or anyone else? I mean, that's we're trying to find solutions here. We have to move one way or the other, and shame sometimes doesn't get it. Maybe sometimes it does. You know,
I think that's
parents.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to finish, cut you off, but no, I think you're right. I think this is the time for public shaming. When you have a representative who doesn't want to hear from their constituents, or only wants to hear from the constituents who are going to give them praise, only wants to hear from the lobbyists or the stakeholders who are going to give them praise and tell them what they want to hear, that goes back to one of those first points I made. They're not actually doing the job of legislating. They're not willing to listen and to learn. And again, even if your political persuasion is one where you agree with what this person's doing, you should be concerned when they're that close-minded, because you're not going to get good laws that way. And that's the sort of thing that needs to be made public, that people need to have good discussions with their neighbors, with the people that they disagree with, to say, listen, you may like what this person's doing, but you should not like how they're doing it. Because one of these days they're going to make a mistake because they didn't hear something that they just stuck their fingers in their ears about. And that's the sort of education that's happened.
Maybe that goes back to the right that we have in West Virginia to instruct your legislators. I mean, I think you want to instruct them on Fridays and send a text message to Hoppy Kercheval, have it go statewide, shame them. You want to do it on social media. When I was looking at these different provisions in the Constitution, there is one on libel. You know, if you're telling the truth, you're protected. So if you tried to reach out to them and they didn't respond to you, that's the truth. And that is one thing that's pretty hardcore in our democracy.
That's right. And Phil probably learned this too in the formerly Pearlie Isaac Reed School of Journalism. The way that you fight libel is with fact and the truth. So yeah, you're right on it there. And that seems like a perfect, like, you know, I don't want to get us confused, because I believe that the people have a Bill of Rights. And so our right is that we are listened to by a representative who might not necessarily agree with, or that I voted for, but that would be my right to have them not shut me down. And, you know, that's an interesting thing. I think that we don't use, you know, I hate that steam release, Barbara, Delegate, because it just, you know, it's like, you know, the old vent line too. You didn't have to have any accountability. And I think it's silly sometimes, but hey, if it's there, then use it and say, my delegate so-and-so, I've tried to call them 3 times and 4 emails that I can show you and they don't answer. And like, you put them out there and then say, Hoppy, why don't you get these people to answer to us? You know, if he wants to have that steam release, then yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends on if it's something that he's in agreement with.
I think he's in agreement with transparency.
You know, yeah. Go ahead, Margaret.
Oh, I just
Are
said,
you frozen or is it me? Oh, okay.
That's all.
I didn't hear what you said, Margaret.
If Hoppy were to get enough calls, that would increase his likelihood of touching it.
But he would read it aloud.
One steam release
aloud on Friday.
Oh, yeah.
You know what?
I've
It
done
doesn't have
it.
to be the same delegate. It can be, yeah, well, you know what? My guy here, and it's probably a guy, right? It's not so much a female representative, but you can say, hey, my guy in, well, Nicholas County is a woman, but you know, here, or if you hear it everywhere. I mean, I just hate to pine about the past, but I do remember when you could walk through the offices and they were all open, and you'd look in and be like, oh, there's so-and-so sitting with so-and-so, or oh, hey, they got some food on the table, I'm gonna go get a piece of candy. Like, you can't even see that anymore because all the doors are closed. All right, we have about a minute left, and I'm thinking that we have, there was one question that asked how transparent will the new voter registration process be? Sally, I'm not sure. What do you mean by the new voter registration process? That just caught my eye. I fear about the change from Eric. She's right. The electronic registration information center. That's what I was worried about. And it goes back to your point, Delegate, about the transparency in all three
Branches of government.
Of our government. Like, we don't know why manner and say why. You know, he purports and says, we've done all of this and we've cleaned up the voter rolls. Yes, because of the use of Eric. And now he wants to get rid of it and send us backward. So that's a good question, Sally. We're working on some of that. The question was, how many bills had been passed using the getting rid of the 3-day reading period? I'm not sure. That one was a one way back there.
Unfortunately.
What'd you say?
I just said lots.
Right. I mean, I'm not sure there's anything that you can do about that. I think it will be interesting that, remember, those of you who are on the panelists and many of you who are listening, we understand this, but I think that it's interesting that how many bills on average get passed in a 60-day session? About 110, is that right?
No, more like 200 or 300.
Okay, but still 10%, 2,000 are still.
Yeah, 2,000 introduced, maybe 200 or 300.
Okay, 10, 15%. What was the percentage of 44 bills introduced and it was either 34 or 37 passed in a 3-day period in the special session? Like, that's above 50%, 75%. I mean, right there is what I think someone might be able to understand how bad it was. Oh, there's Judy. I knew she'd be on it. 333 bills in 2023. I'm going to give you guys about 10 seconds each if anybody wants to say anything. Go ahead, Eli.
So, I mean, I was just gonna add, that process of suspending rules was fine for very simple issues, for things where there was broad bipartisan consensus. But where it's being changed now is that one supermajority is using it to push through very complex issues, very divisive issues, and they're doing it to bypass what they know is going to be difficult debate. They don't want to hear the opposition. And that's a change that I've seen even over these 8 years. So, you know, it's not even using it, it's how it's being used. And that's that small erosion, but that adds up to something really big and really dangerous.
Yeah, very good point. Anyone else? Last few seconds.
Well, I would like to say that I am very, very concerned about the media, that we have city and county newspapers that are hanging on by a thread. And they are the ones, and radios too. I mean, they are the ones that help get the word out. We have social media now, and that's an improvement. We have the website, which I do think we should say that is an improvement, but I'm very worried about the media. And I appreciate all the groups that got together to have this. I think it was a really good brainstorming session. I hope we end up thinking about, we should use the tools we have, but let's think about what are the new tools that we should demand.
Yes, talking about the media, I'm in complete agreement that I'm very concerned about the the future of state house coverage, particularly when you have fewer reporters and fewer editions of publications that we don't want to make it easier for the legislature and the branches of government to be less transparent, but I'm afraid that's what will happen if you have even fewer and fewer watchdogs watching the process.
Yeah, I pulled up this book that is from Martha Minow, Saving the News, and it says exactly those same things. And one that I took in particular was, if we don't have local news, then the cost of government goes up, because we don't know how much someone's being paid, how much they're spending on something, because we don't have the news. And I look at it, and I can say this because I was those young buck reporters who are just going to get the story. And I talk from the broadcast side too. You got that interview, you got your VOSOT that you're getting ready to go to. You haven't had time to research or to investigate. And sometimes you don't have the courage to ask the follow-up question to an elected congressperson or senator, and you go on to do your next story. And that's the tough part of it. And I've seen, and I feel as though some elected folks are obviously taking advantage of that. And we've seen it's unconscionable what's happening with the governor's office, and continuing to have video and not having face-to-face with the media and answering those questions in a news conference type of thing. So that's something that we have to talk about. And if you argue and grumble about paying a subscription to a local newspaper, then you're not going to have it, and you're not going to have those old newspaper clippings to look back on either. So there you go, the fourth estate in all of this. Thank you all for being part of this. I feel like we could go on and on and on. I love the idea of, yes, the new tools, use those. Thank you again, and catch us again next month. We'll be here with another democracy series. Stay with us. We'll see you.